Hello.
Hello.
How goes it? How's things?
Yeah, good here. Thanks. How are things with you?
Can't complain. Usual stuff going on, but yeah, life continues. How about you? How about you, Cara?
Good. I feel like, I feel much more optimistic about treatments that are coming in, and I don't know how it's being handled where I am in London, which was a disaster in spring. So I'm feeling really happy, but I realize everyone has a different perspective on how.
Yeah, I was remembering just this week. It was a year ago. I was last in London, and it was the record-breaking heat wave. It was a really I think it was a Thursday, and it was like super hot. Well, 38 degrees or something, and we just stayed in a hotel. Like, just didn't want to, because it just, which is funny because if it was 38 degrees here, we wouldn't even talk about it. I don't know why that is, but it's just, maybe it's air conditioning or something, but like you wouldn't even, it's just a warm day. But I didn't want that in London. I didn't want to be running around London in the heat, and wasn't very nice. All right. So yeah, last time I wasn't around. Was there anything interesting discussed, or was it mostly going through? Not that it's not interesting, but going through the roadmap and continuing on with that.
We had a couple of new participants last time, so we're able to have a sort of retrospective on what we've done to date and get people up to speed with what we're doing and how to engage. I haven't had any submissions from that direction as yet, but there was a lot of interest in potentially doing some stuff.
That's good. So I guess we can continue on, unless anyone had anything interesting this week. Trying to think if I did take a note of something. I'll paste it in the chat here, I guess. So a friend of mine, that's his project and I guess company as well, that have a bunch of interesting ML engineering toolkits for sort of tracking experiments, providing a bit more rigor around running these experiments, which I thought was interesting. It's very Python centric, but it seemed to resonate with stuff I've seen where you often want to run a bunch of experiments and kick them off and let them run. That was an interesting link. Another one, just got to find it. I saw it this week. Was a Netflix project. Is it Metaflow? I'll paste a link to that. Netflix is open source. I'm always a bit in two minds of, because they have sort of a habit of sort of retiring things, because they build things for their own purposes, but once they no longer support it, they can't justify continuing it unless someone takes it and runs with it. Like Spinnaker, for example, lives on. Obviously, Netflix use it, but it's under the CDF. So, but this Metaflow one was interesting because it's sort of building tool. Maybe it's similar to some of the aims that you've had, Terry. It's sort of to enable data scientists to build and operate, and sort of take some of the engineering away. Not so much building tools for developers, which is that other one, Guild AI is more for that, but more for to bring the data scientists along. So I thought that was an interesting one. I'll put it in the notes. I thought it was an interesting project, that Metaflow. I don't really, I haven't looked any further into it, but if it was sort of a workflowy thing, is that something that we should think about, from the CDF point of view, as it might be an interesting project? Because last I heard, and Cara might know more, there is there's always the lookout for new interesting projects to sort of invite to be part of the CDF, and give it that Netflix is already part of it in a big way. I thought it could be interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly worth, if nothing else, reaching out to people and making sure that they're aware of the roadmap and that they've seen it.
Mm-hmm. I'll take a note to do that, because we got some connections there.
We do seem to be steadily building attention now. We're getting, you know, a number of people joining the mailing list each week. I'm regularly getting messages from people expressing support for the idea of having a roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's slowly growing organically without a lot of promotion at the moment.
Yeah.
Once we get close to a first published version, I think we can have a bigger push to make sure that people are aware of the existence and have read it and are starting to consider the implications of it.
Well, I'll see if I can find someone there, and yeah, maybe mention it to them, and then who knows whether it leads to something else with the CDF. That could be interesting. But the Netflix angle is interesting, because it would be, like a lot of things Netflix, reasonably opinionated to the Netflix way of working, which is proven, and probably fairly AWS heavy, at least to start with, which is fine. That's where people are. Like, I've noticed they've added support for step functions, which I always thought would be kind of useful for long running things. I use Google stuff, and they have their own, you know, equivalents to managed functions and so on. But yeah, Netflix are obviously all in on Amazon, so I thought that'll be an interesting one to look up. So I'll just take a note to.
Certainly, it would be great to have them attend this meeting and the other MLOps meeting as well, and just discuss with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that'd be interesting, and there's already a sorry, I'm just taking notes. Yeah, Netflix already in on the CDF, so you know they're yeah. My first thing when I saw something from Netflix was I saw the GitHub project, and I'm like, oh, is this another you know, Asgard? Or there are all these projects that they built and then kind of, I wouldn't say abandon them, they just kind of retire them, which is fair enough, because if they don't have a self-sustaining community, if Netflix aren't using them, then they move on from it. But if they do, then they find a way to work with it. Like Spinnaker is a good example of that success. So I wasn't sure where this one felt, but it seemed to line up with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. But from the angle of let's build the framework for data scientists to make it as pleasant as possible to do the right thing with whatever tools you need to use. Without having to learn too much, and it's battle hardened, and that's the thing that interests me most about this stuff, is it's battle hardened at Netflix. Like, that's their kind of pitch. So
I do think we need to have a bit more thought about how we're going to promote the roadmap in general. I was going to do the conference circuit, but obviously that got completely disrupted this year. And for some reason, the talks that we originally had set up for our conference didn't get renewed. So I'm no longer doing the MLOps overview that I was planning to do.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
is this?
Sorry?
Which conference is this that your talk has been withdrawn from?
So we had to reschedule the CDF mini conference,
Yeah.
and apparently the talks weren't carried over. So I'm not going to be doing the introduction to the roadmap that I was expecting to do.
Are there other, like, what's the audience to evangelize this to or publicize? Is it developer heavy or data science heavy? Because I imagine there'd be different places where people hang out, especially now that everyone's kind of finding these online ways of doing things. Like, you've got Google doing a multiple week thing. There's reInvents, like a smeared over 3 weeks in December, which sounds crazy, but maybe that works. People sort of, you know, spend a day each week on something. Like, are there other places that it makes sense to introduce this, like where data scientists or developers with a data science bent, like where do they virtually hang out?
So I think PyData, I think their CFP is still open.
What is it?
PyData.
PyData, as in Python.
Yeah, Python data science. Like it's quite a good conference. I think it's the London version, although they may be combining them all together. And it is run underneath the Python Software Foundation. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different AI and machine learning groups and meetups out there. So I guess we just need to start thinking about a strategy for getting in touch with those and offering to speak.
There was some people on the BizDev side on Amazon that were interested in it. They're probably lurking on the mailing list. I don't think they've made it to a meeting yet. I'm not sure what they would have on, but yeah. And getting implementers of it as well, like people who are sort of boots on the ground would be good as well, because they're the ones that often field the questions of some of these issues that we're addressing. Whereas the pure data scientists, I mean, we still need to talk to them, because the benefit there is convincing them that it's important. Like it's like your, you know, facts and figures around how many things never make it to production, or the ones that do don't get updated. That's kind of relevant, and yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Because it's worth thinking about that soon, because things are fleshing out pretty nicely now. So there was one, I had an open pull request that I was going to close, Terry, pull request number 27, which I'll paste in here, which was around reinforcement learning, which had a typo and everything.
So I think there was a piece in there that we probably wanted to capture. I think I remember putting in the comments that we had got some gaps that we'd previously talked about that we should probably include in that area. So maybe just check that thread before you close it and see if there was something that needed to be closed.
Yeah, the one that I did capture from that was the you know, colloquially known as the swearing problem. Actually, that reminds me that since we last talked, that whole GPT thing really took off on the web. Everyone's talking about that OpenAI thing with great amusement. I've applied to get API access. I assume you've had a go too, but I haven't. No one I know has got access to it yet. But I thought that was interesting. I did read the paper on it, and it mentioned things in this area of because it's trained on a common crawl set of data. Like they can't guarantee its behavior at all, which I thought was interesting. Not quite the same as an MLOps angle, but yeah, it just reminded me of it then, the GPT-3 stuff. It's an interesting paper to look at too. So we did merge in the stuff to do with that swearing problem and the emergency sort of kill switch idea. And this was kind of related to that, but I was trying to capture it that reinforcement learning is extra risky in this regard because there's less, or at least in my mind, there's less of an explicit train, test, blue, green, canary, deploy. With reinforcement learning, it's more on the fly. But that might, I don't know how that fits in this roadmap, or maybe it doesn't. Like maybe,
Well,
like you're saying, reinforcement learning is really just it's a pattern that's applied where there's this sort of faster, tighter loop of there's new data, things get trained, it gets promoted or not, depending on. Yeah, sorry, Terry.
Yeah, I think there's a challenge entry that we're missing, kind of addressing that and pointing out that those techniques sit outside of the traditional release and deploy approach, and so we probably need to just give a little bit of thought to that and express that as a challenge, even if we don't have a good set of requirements to go with it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of was my intention, was that this is a whole evolving area that we're not covering. But yeah, we don't have necessarily anything to say on it in terms of a solution. It's just, if people are going to do it, they're going to do it. Of train.
But it may be that there are things that you can do within your CI/CD environment that actually help to improve the quality of that. So, there's one area of CI/CD that is really sort of maintenance related, in that a lot of the platforms at the moment are focused on doing build and release, and then doing all the verification and checks on the artifacts that you're releasing. But actually, from a customer perspective, there's a requirement to continuously reevaluate iteratively to make sure that you haven't, for example, inherited a risk from new CVEs or 0 days or anything else. So ideally, these platforms should also be doing automated rebuilds at a regular cadence, just to keep the tests running and to make sure that you're re-evaluating software that proactively that's already in production. And if you're using things like self-learning algorithms that are effectively self-modifying code, you could write those in such a way that they are pushing information back into the CI/CD
CI/CD, and then it's getting verified there, right?
It will get verified.
Even though it's already in production, you're still right. So I'm trying to think of a software, not a traditional, classical software analogy to that. And I guess sometimes you'd call that like a synthetic transaction almost. Like people would sometimes use or do use CI/CD systems to kind of run through an end-to-end scenario to make sure people can sign up to the website, that they can process a credit card. It's effectively blurring the lines between monitoring and CI/CD. Like, I know when people talk about models and AI, they talk about monitoring a lot. So maybe this is the same thing. It's blurring the line. I'll see. Just got to try and capture that. Just taking some notes. Yeah. I think some people are using the term continuous verification for something like this. So it's the same CI/CD thing, but it's after the D, the delivery, but you still keep doing it, and that's the verification. But it's effectively the same thing, because when people say monitoring or observability, they're more thinking about probes or signals or metrics or tracing and things like that. Whereas this isn't so much that. This is more just, are things in an okay state based on some set of criteria, like by automating things and driving a synthetic transaction. So yeah, that's a good, that's a fair comment, I think, to capture. Maybe that's, yeah. I just thought, I really wanted to mention something about reinforcement learning. I just thought it was important. So,
and I think this is actually an area where CI/CD is weak at the moment. It's almost like we need CI/CD CV so that you're automating the continuous review process. Especially in a heavily containerized environment, you have to expect that every container image that you rely on is evolving over time. Each one can potentially develop vulnerabilities that will be discovered over time, and all of your dependencies are similar. The risk with CI/CD is that people want to treat it as fire and forget. So you ship a product and then ignore it until you've got some new features to add.
Right.
But realistically, you actually want to be monitoring the health of that set of IP on a regular cadence, and evaluating how much effort is going to be involved in updating the product if dependencies are changing. And also you need to be evaluating the severity of any CVEs that impact your existing dependencies. So it's almost you want a predictive model that says, look, here's your production product today. Here's the vulnerabilities that are in it this week. Here's the things that have changed underneath it because dependencies have changed. Here's our estimation of how much effort is involved in actually updating this product to align it to all the latest changes. Here's our estimation of the level of risk you're carrying at the moment with this product if you leave it as is. And then if we extend that to MLOps, then we're also factoring in any drift in our models, any catastrophic forgetting, any dynamic learning that's going on operationally, and it just gives you another set of metrics against which you can evaluate the health of your IP.
Yeah, I guess people, or some people think of sort of CI/CD infrastructure as production. Typically, it's separated from it. At least that's where people are today. But yeah, I could see it in terms of availability and uptime. People expect it to be, always available. So it's reasonable to think that it's should be there to be used continuously. I guess one of the benefits in theory of something like Tecton is it runs on the same infrastructure or the same. It might be separated off namespace wise or via some partitioning for access purposes, but essentially it's running alongside everything else as a peer to everything else. Whereas in the past it was, CI servers were an external concern and it would fling it over the walls with a production environment. Yeah. So I guess it's the same analogy as software. It's just that in like a typical microservice or a typical web app or something, if there's no developers making changes on a given month, then there's not going to be any change-based activity. But in a MLOps world, the model could be evolving, even if you're not doing reinforcement learning or online learning or unsuper or anything like that. just the fact that the data is changing and drifting over time would trigger a new deploy of a model, even without a person present potentially. You know, that might be quite reasonable. That's sort of the things I'm doing. There's this window of, you know, when there's a certain amount of change, you retrain the model, you get the new one because you want the model to have learned from recent changes, and that's, yeah, I guess the software analogy, there is analogies set in software, like if you're using something like SNCC or some other, or white source, or some automated system that looks for CVEs in open source libraries you use, it can tell you that there's a problem or even open a pull request, which triggers a build. And if you're very keen, if it passed and it was okay, you could have it deploy to a staging or production environment for you. Ditto with things like Docker Hub, when some base layer image, there's some SSH 0-day or something that gets patched in an image that you depend on in container, then that's an input. It's not source code from you, but it's just like, it could be an input that doesn't require a human to initiate. A human might approve it, but effectively all the work's done by a machine. So I guess there are analogies there too, but that's fairly bleeding edge. Typically a person would be notified and then they would change the, you know, the Docker file to say from this version, or the library file, and check that it works by hand. And maybe that's the model analogy as well. But in theory, there's no reason why you couldn't have humans out of that loop for those sort of changes. So you're not really changing the hand-coded functionality, but you are improving your software in some way, either through a security patch or a more relevant model. So
well, I think that the challenge right now is that most solutions to that are either bespoke to a given organization, or they're features of third-party sort of security scanning packages which hook back into your build process. I think in general that's actually a gap in the CI/CD tooling space, and you know, it's more obvious to us from an MLOps perspective, but it is a generic requirement for the ICD.
Yeah, a lot of people assume that the trigger is to something is some source code changing, but there's a whole lot of other things that could trigger a pipeline.
I think the challenge for CI/CD is that it works extremely well for startups who are in full-on feature development mode, so they're constantly changing things. But there are a lot of enterprise use cases where you build a piece of software and you don't want to touch it for a year. And then that's actually invisibly rotting behind the scenes. And you only find out when there's an incident that there was something wrong with it.
I mean, isn't that
try and patch something and you can't rebuild it because it's drifted too far away from the...
Yeah. I mean, it's multiplied with microservices. Like if people are doing that, then the odds of that are much higher versus a monolithic app where you're going to have naturally more change because there's more people putting their hands in the one code base. Yeah, I guess the Googles and Facebooks of the world get around it by, that's deliberately why they use the mono repos, because everyone's hands are in it all the time. So if there's some dependency to be upgraded, then you have a chance that it will be upgraded everywhere versus just drifting. That's the theory that I heard anyway.
Certainly, if you look at something like a large government IT solution, that will be funded as a linear project. So it will have budget to deliver version 1, and then there'll be typically no funding for anything else unless somebody decides they want a change in functionality, and then they'll spin up another project to change it. So
which is very it's very unfortunate in a way, because, you know, software is more like bringing a pet home. Then it's, yeah, they always require care and feeding in surprising ways. So they had a few, like I was looking at the Just opening the roadmap now. There are a few sections I wanted to ask some questions on. So it's in the solutions, sorry, the requirements. So a few cells down in the TBD, there's one that says managing the security of data in the MLOps process with particular focus upon the increased risk associated with aggregated data sets. Is that related to use for training or batch processing? Is that related to people giving permission and then revoking permission of the training data? Or maybe you've trained a model from some aggregate set of customer data and someone ceases becoming a customer, so you legally can't use their data to train their historical data to train your model. Is that what that means, or is the security mean something else? Or is this the security of the source data, like the training sets of data that you have to keep copies of? That is an issue because you've got, this potentially PII and other things lying around, metaphorically.
I put this one in as a bookmark to get us to do a general consideration of security aspects.
Right.
Because, clearly we're dealing with typically highly sensitive data in large aggregations. So that means that we need to think more carefully about the problems, because you're almost always going to be a high value target.
Well, you're keeping all this data around, so yeah, and the sheer volume of it makes it risky. It's because you can't throw it away when you can't throw it away if you want to be able to go back and explain how it.
But you've also got this situation where you're actually commanding access to a very large amount of computing power. So if you're running an MLOps process on a large project, you could be commanding hundreds of servers, in which case you then also become a target for anyone who would like to be able to use a lot of servers for free. Hence why we had the situation recently with Microsoft and people subverting Kubeflow to use it for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, right. Just because of that's pretty common in cloud platforms, just because things can scale out so automatically. Right. Yeah.
So one of the things that we need to think about is, should we be building tools that allow you to execute arbitrary pieces of code, or should we be going to a level where we're actually signing and accrediting each component and ensuring that only valid code is being executed as part of a pipeline?
One of the things Google announced was their with AMD, their secure computing stuff, where things stay encrypted until it's well inside the processor, which I thought was interesting. Down the track, that could be mentioned as some solution. Maybe there's other things. If it's about the security of the data, maybe from the very start, you can, for example, you could hash a bunch of data. Maybe you don't need, for your particular model, you don't actually need the raw address of people or something, or coordinates. It could be hashed in some way, but still yield. So the recommendation would be, well, if you can do that, you should, but sometimes you can't. I see what you mean. Yeah, it's those different angles. Yeah.
For example, if you look at Tecton at the moment, all you have to do is give it a text string, which is the URL of an image, and it'll download that as a container and execute it in your pipeline.
Yeah, and
But it
be
will
quite
literally
happy to do that.
download anything from anywhere if you can get control of that text string,
Hmm.
which isn't stored encrypted.
Yeah. Scrolling down a bit further to past the governance section, there's management of shared dependencies between training and operational phases. What are you thinking there?
So when you're working with machine learning data, typically you have some raw data, and then you need to pre-process that data to encode it in
Encode
some
it like
form.
one hot encoding or something if it's a text or whatever. Yeah.
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 And you'll usually do some pre-processing on it to redact certain things or to remove
Remove
punctuation.
outliers or clean it up or balance it in
Yeah.
some way. Yeah.
Now typically those pre-processing steps apply to the training data and to the operational data that you're inferencing
Right.
against.
Yeah. You need to, before you ask it for a prediction, you've got to, right. Yep.
So actually, when you deploy this, you have to deploy not just the model,
yes,
but also the set of pre-processing
activities.
activities.
It's interesting. I sort of encountered that myself, and my solution was that it's the one bit of code, which may not be the ideal thing, but in this simple case, it worked. And it's just, am I training or not? And there's just a few little bits that change, but all of the code to massage the data or extract it from the GraphQL system is the same. It's just it's either pulling out a great big chunk of it and then telling it to train on something, or it's pulling out a subset. And that was that's a good point. And I see what you mean. That makes sense. It's just the solution in my case was it was the one bit of code. It just made sense, but I can imagine that could be problematic for more complex cases, or they're using notebooks in training, but you don't want to use the same. You don't want to have the notebook in production, so you want to extract the chunks of Python that use certain libraries that might not be appropriate. Well, you need, if something's not appropriate for production, then you should be using it to prepare the data.
And also there are subtleties to that, like the way you need to scale that for training is typically different to the way you need to scale it for production.
Yeah, very much so.
So again, the default idea of it's just some hack together code in a notebook and it follows around everywhere doesn't work except in a narrow sweet spot of particular applications. And so that's a problem that really needs a generic solution that requires a bit more thought than just bang everything in a notebook and it'll be fine.
Yeah. And below that abstraction layer for models, is that related to portability and or is this more of an API?
That one I've actually just done a PR for.
Right. I didn't see that one. Oh, okay. Yep. I haven't had a look at that, so I'll have a look at that. Yep. Great. Yep.
So again, that's another one that's relatively easy to explain, but is going to be hard to implement well.
Moving on from that, escalation of data categories. That rings a bell, but I can't remember. What's the define a data category?
So that's where you're evaluating the sensitivity of the data that you're working with. So, if you're dealing with public domain data.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's the right. Yep. It's whether it's PII and
personal information or
there's European rules. There's probably different national rules, and then there might be information about minors in there, and things like that. Child protection laws and right. So
but there are also caveats around how the sensitivity of data goes up as you aggregate more of it. So there's a difference between holding a set of records for an individual versus holding a set of records for every individual in a geographic area, for example.
Yep.
Because having a known set of information about one individual might be relatively easy to redact and pseudonymize and be fairly protected. But if you've got a big block of data for everyone in a particular area, it becomes much easier to detect rare features in that block and then
right and de-anonymize things. Like a recent example of that was mentioned a few sessions ago about I think it was insurance companies or mortgage companies basically detecting socioeconomic status from this aggregate data, stuff that wasn't explicitly disclosed. They were able to extract a feature or it was and bias things accordingly, or it would reveal effectively someone's race. And then the model was then making decisions on race. Race wasn't explicitly provided, but with that data in aggregate, you could extract that feature if you like.
The behavior of large blocks of data is different to the behavior of small blocks of data, and that has some really interesting outcomes. So, for example, you probably know the story about the Australian census.
Yes, I was about to bring that up.
Find the average Australian.
Yeah.
Yes. Because the census data gives you a very clear picture of what the average Australian actually looks like, but there is no individual in Australia who actually meets that description.
Yeah. Yeah. There's other concerns with that census as well, because in the most recent one, 2016, so that means we're due another one soon. They were asking questions that normally would be a protected category, like stuff around religion and things, and which is sensitive on its own, but to ensure quality, they were requiring people to put their names on it, not just anonymous. And then there became a data security concern, like how are they anonymizing things, and people were showing that they weren't really anonymizing. You can with enough data, you can walk backwards pretty easily to an individual. So there's all sorts of concerns because it escalated to that. It's asking about people's incomes and their background, and all of this personal information that even your closest friends don't really know. So yeah, it sort of escalated. I guess that's how I see escalated. And it escalated up to a category of you don't really want anyone to know this. So as luck would have it, I happened to be out of the country that time in New Zealand, so I didn't have to do it. And actually a few people did leave the country deliberately to avoid it. Can't do that this year. So yeah. All right, that makes sense. I got a good sense. So there's only a few left to do, so I think I could have a crack at that in the next week or two. and see if we can
Yeah,
sort of get
I think we're very close to closing off the known technical requirements. I think we've probably got 1 or 2 outstanding challenges that we could still add to
probably add, yeah.
this year's document. Then we should probably close that off. And then the final section is we need to go through these, evaluate the status of things to date. So we update the chart in the final chapter, and then potentially add some narrative about existing potential solutions, and how we expect them to evolve.
Right. Yeah, and that could include things like Jenkins X, the Metaflow from Netflix, or whatever it is. Different approaches people have talked about. There's lots of conference talks. And Cara, do you want to add those links to this week's notes in the doc?
Yes.
I'll add you the link to the doc there, because that'd be good. Because we could add, there's a references section at the bottom, so we might. There's lots of links in these notes throughout this Google Doc, so we can always, if it's suitable, add links to some prior art there. And yeah, no, it's good. It's sort of, it's like there's not that much left to flesh this out, which will be good. All right, well, is there anything else? We probably have a slight early mark, or and then meet again in 2 weeks. Hopefully I'll have done a few more sessions of this, and I'll see if I got in touch with anyone from the Netflix side to get them interested. That'll be good.
Okay, great.
All right.
All right, thanks everyone.
Well, stay well and talk to you next time, and hope the other session goes well. The other session's been going on. I sort of flick through the notes every now and then, but they're going okay. Like I just didn't see them the last.
So the other meeting tends to be dominated by Kubeflow technical discussions. Right. So they tend to use that meeting as one of their technical design meetings. So it's the roadmap is not featuring as highly in that group, but I try and.
Well, that's all right.
Piece in.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. Thanks, Terry and Cara. Nice to chat again, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.